Welcome to Lesson 5, Color Correcting Like a Pro. In this lesson, you discover the techniques used by color professionals to correct images, and it's relatively easy to do. A lot of people overwork their images, and that's because they don't know the techniques and how to measure color. So let's change that by following this lesson. I'm opening up 0502, and I've got a picture of a garden. And the first thing I want to make sure you're aware of is that you should be making your changes in the RGB mode, if possible. If you've already been provided with an image in the CMYK mode, it won't really change much by switching back to RGB, but sometimes I suggest that people do that just because some of the functionality that you want to access is not available in the CMYK mode. Now here's the thing, if I go under Edit Color Settings, I do want to make sure that I set this correctly. And you'll see that as a default, this is set for general purpose. If I select Pre-Press, what I'm going to get is a look on the screen that represents more of the capabilities of a typical press. Now, it doesn't do this right away because I'm in the RGB format, but if I simply press Control or Command Y, you'll see that up at the top, now says that I'm in RGB, but I'm getting a CMYK preview, and that's a toggle switch. So Control or Command Y will turn that off or on. You may notice a difference when you switch things like, for instance, different color paper or changing the dot gain. Now, if you think you're not seeing much of a difference, press Control or Command Y and look someplace like in the dark area, and you'll see that it might be a little bit more rich in the RGB mode than when it's in CMYK. Now I'm going to switch this back to the default of the North America Pre-Press 2, the default for printing, because I want those of you who do actually have to print your work to see that you can even go into the CMYK. You can choose one of the standard settings for sheet fed, coded, or web coded. Those of you who don't know print, US web coded has nothing to do with the internet. Web is the big roll of paper on a press that prints things like Time magazine and large publications. It's a roll of paper, and there are some considerations when you do print on the web, especially with ink and color. But you can also come in here and select Custom CMYK, and if you have a really great relationship with your printer or your press guy, you can set things up in here like dot gain and what your total ink limit is and all sorts of things. I'm going to cancel that for right now. And again, leave this just at North American Pre-Press. If those profile mismatch dialog boxes drive you crazy, uncheck that and just tell it to preserve embedded profiles and click OK. Now, how do we know how to adjust color? The best and easiest way is to look for neutrals in your images, and not all images have neutrals. Neutrals are shades of gray. And if you're modifying a picture of somebody on a beach and there's an orange sunset, or you're changing something that does not contain a neutral, then it's unlikely that people will notice what's called a color cast. They notice color cast in things that have neutral grays and also skin tones. So let me talk to you about the neutral grays and how you can adjust for them right here. I'm going up to my window and I'm selecting the info palette. And I'm just positioning it over something that I know is gray. And I'm looking at the RGB. When you're working with gray, all values should be equal. So for instance, if I go to my color picker and I come in here and I type in 150, 150, 150, it makes gray. And if I come in here and type 200, 200, 200, it makes a different shade of gray. But equal amounts of RGB color make neutrals. So if I look at this value, I can see that that's just a little bit off. I can see that the red's a little low because it's at 116, green at 126 is smack in the middle, and blue is at 123. So what do we do with this? We know it needs to be corrected. We'll start out by finding the highlights and shadows of this image, and then we'll make a curve adjustment. So the first thing I'm going to do is cheat and go to Image Adjustments and select something called Threshold. Threshold simply turns this into something that's black and white. I'm using this so I can quickly and easily find the lightest and darkest point in this image. So I drag this all the way over to the left and you'll see the darkest stays, or all the way to the right, and the lightest object stays. So I'll pull this over a little bit to the lightest object, hold down my shift key, and click to put a color sampler down. If you miss, you can always hold your shift key and drag that sampler around. Now I'm dragging this to the left and I'm finding the darkest point. And I'm finding the darkest point in the part of the image that's important to me. So the woods, that's not so important, but maybe over here, and you can turn off and on the preview to see it a little bit better. I'll go ahead and I'll shift click right here and then cancel this. Make sure you cancel. If you say okay, you're left with an image that looks like this. And you can just simply press Control or Command Z. It'll keep your color samplers and put you back where you were. But I'm going to press cancel. Now, I'm going over to my layers panel and I'm going to pull it out so you can see it a little better. I'm selecting from the new fill or adjustment layer, curves, and I'm double clicking on this white eyedropper and I'm setting it for 5, magenta 3, yellow 3. And these are just values that you can find as default values for CMYK. It does change your RGB. I just know the values very well in CMYK. Even though we're working in RGB, it's fine. You can change lab colors, hue, saturation, brightness, whatever you want, but we're finding a neutral highlight that has some sort of value in it. Otherwise, you create something that looks like a specular highlight, like something shiny, and we don't want that, especially in something like a chair. So I pressed OK, and yes, keep those color target values. And if I set up my color settings correctly, I don't even need to set my black point. It knows, based upon my total ink limit and other things that I've selected, how much black I can get in my image. So I simply take my highlight tool, which looks like a little white eyedropper, and I click and say that's where I want the lightest point, and my darkest point I want over here. And now I'm going to go ahead and adjust for the gray. Now, you could cheat if you're in a hurry and just take this middle gray, sample a gray point eyedropper, and click on something gray, and you can see that it adjusted it quickly. I'm going to undo that because I want to show you a way that you can use for multiple points inside your image. And how I'm going to do that is while I have this curve window open, or properties window, I should say, I'm going to shift click in a gray area, maybe right over here. And you'll see that now I have a number 3 sampler. And the numbers before I opened up the curves in the properties panel, those were the values, 122, 134, and 135. Then you see the slash. These are the values now that I've made some adjustments inside with the highlight and shadow. Red is 115, green is 127, and blue is 130. They're still not even, but you're seeing that in both of them, green is kind of the center, which means to make this balanced, I'm going to want to bring red up to 127, or approximately there, and blue down to 127. So I go back to my properties panel. I'm going to pull this away so I can read the info as I make adjustments. I'm going to go into red first. And I am going to come over here to my little color sampler, and I'm going to turn on the click and drag an image to modify the curve button. And I'm going to hold down my Control or Command key. Now, first of all, before I even hold down the key, you can see that by having that button turned on, I can read values where they're placed on that curve. But I'm going to hold down my Control or Command key and just click on that spot, and it puts an anchor point for me right where that value is. I can now grab that value, you can see red, and pull it so that it matches the green. So now they're both 123. I just need to adjust blue. Blue. Same thing. I'm going to go ahead and Command or Control click on that, or just, you can put an anchor point in if you want. If you don't want to click and add one, you can just add one right on the curve yourself. And we're going to pull that down till it's 123. And now I know that's perfectly balanced. Now, how can I tell the difference? Well, if I move this out, let me go back to my layers panel. You'll see that based upon that curve adjustment, look how it had this green cast to it that was kind of covering everything. We used to call those dirty ink casts. And when you undo that, it looks a lot better. Now I can even go back to the main RGB and just even add a little bit of contrast to this and brightness by simply grabbing hold of the curve and pulling up slightly. You don't want to do too much, because if you do too much, you're going to degrade or take information out of the image. So I'm pulling it up slightly. And then maybe I want to add some contrast. You can see this is the dark area of the image. I'm just pulling this down to make a little bit of an S. And if you look at this, this is actually your quarter tones here and your mid-tones and your three-quarter tones. So you can use that to add a little bit of brightness or contrast. And you'll notice that now when I turn off or on this, look at the difference in that image. Looks much better. Now I'm going to click on background. And in fact, I'm going to take both of these and select them by just holding down my Shift key or Control or Command, whichever one you want, and right click, and I'm going to select that I want to convert this to a smart object. And if I double click on it, it'll open up the embedded file that still exists if I want to go back and change that curve. It opens up as a PSB file, which I'm going to close. But the reason I'm doing that is because I want to come in and apply a filter, and that is unsharp mask. And I'm going to really exaggerate this for a reason. I'll pull this up. And depending upon your subject matter, you can increase or decrease this unsharp masking. I typically start at about 150, but you can go all the way up to 500 if you want, which looks pretty bad in this instance. The radius I have at 1, that's because it's creating a little bit of a halo with that radius. And the threshold, I'm going to set it at about 10. And what the threshold does is it indicates that if there's a level of contrast between one object and another, you should create a halo to make it look sharper. But if that value is within 10 shades of the other one next to it, ignore it. So you can see it gets more smooth as you pull it up. I typically leave this around 10 or so. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit. You can see a preview. You can click and hold. Click OK. Now the benefit to using a filter, of course, on a smart object is that now maybe I improved the image in some areas, but this looks a little funky here. Make sure you're always at 100% view. And so I can click on that little mask there, take my paintbrush, make sure I have black, make my brush a little bigger by pressing my right bracket, and say I don't want sharpening there. That's okay. Or I can change the opacity by pressing the number 5. You can see that changes my opacity, and say I only want 50% sharpening here. Or I can press X to go back to white and say bring back 50% of that. So it gives you the opportunity to apply filters in a nice way in which you can sharpen different areas easily. Now I can always turn that off if I want and then go back to that original image. So in this lesson, you discovered how you can take advantage of using curves to correct color.